Growing up, I, Eleanor, 32 years old, always felt like a supporting character in the epic saga of my brother Michael, 30, the undisputed golden child. His path was paved with parental adoration and endless financial backing. His expensive undergraduate degree and lavish gap-year travels were funded without a second thought, celebrated as investments in his brilliant future. Meanwhile, my own intellectual passions, like historical preservation and specialized research, were met with polite disinterest, my quiet successes in a niche field largely unacknowledged. The disparity was starkly symbolized by the family heirlooms, my grandmother's antique jewelry and great-grandfather's rare stamp collection, objects steeped in legacy and affection, constantly showcased to Michael as his future inheritance, yet always kept just beyond my reach, embodying a favoritism that ran deeper than mere possessions. I had cultivated a life of independent achievement, yet in the eyes of our parents, it seemed, I remained perpetually secondary, my worth unseen. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The announcement of Michael's MBA acceptance from a top-tier business school wasn't just news, it was a lavish family event, complete with a celebratory dinner at their favorite upscale restaurant, effusive toasts, and parents radiating a profound, almost sacred pride that never quite seemed to extend to me. The cost, a staggering $120,000 for tuition alone, was discussed not with concern, but with triumphant glee, framed as a shrewd, non-negotiable investment in Michael's unequivocally brilliant future, and by extension, the family's enduring legacy. My father, with a booming satisfaction, spoke of securing Michael's place at the forefront of his industry, while my mother meticulously planned the aesthetics of his new apartment near campus, discussing furniture and professional wardrobe upgrades with an intensity usually reserved for state visits. This casual, unquestioning financial outlay stood in stark, almost brutal contrast to my own journey, a path riddled with self-funded struggles and quiet sacrifices for a career they deemed niche and ultimately less consequential. I had navigated the labyrinthine world of student loans for my art history degree, a field I passionately pursued despite its perceived lack of corporate prestige, and painstakingly bootstrapped my freelance historical consulting business through meager savings and competitive, often grueling grant applications, all while they preached the virtues of self-reliance to me, a sermon never delivered to Michael. This pervasive disparity solidified the quiet resentment that had simmered within me for years, transforming it into a slow, persistent burn. I vividly recalled a conversation just 2 years prior, when my old, ailing Honda Civic, my lifeline to remote archaeological sites, had finally succumbed to a catastrophic transmission failure, demanding an urgent and substantial $1,800 repair. Cautiously, with a humility born of ingrained expectation, I had approached my parents, not for a handout, but a temporary interest-free loan, explaining the critical role the car played in my professional mobility. My father's response had been a gentle but firm dismissal. "Eleanor, we've always admired your independence. We're confident you'll find a solution, perhaps explore public transport or carpooling for a while." My mother had quickly added, "Challenges build character, darling. You're so resourceful, you'll overcome this." Yet for Michael, the path to character building seemed entirely devoid of financial struggle, paved instead with six-figure investments and parental carte blanche. Their rationale for his MBA was always articulated with grand pronouncements about future-proofing, networking unparalleled opportunities, and elevating the family's standing, while their explanation for my lack of equivalent support was rooted in a narrative of fostering my unique self-sufficiency. This deeply felt lack of equivalent investment, the stark reality of how differently we were valued, created an ever-widening chasm in my perception of our family dynamics, revealing a profound and painful betrayal that went far beyond mere money. While Michael was busy securing his academic credentials with my parents' generous financial backing, I, Eleanor, was quietly forging a career built on meticulous research, unwavering dedication, and a genuine passion for the past. My expertise in historical preservation, particularly in 19th century architectural reconstruction, had taken years of diligent work, countless hours spent poring over dusty blueprints and fragile archival documents, and hands-on experience in challenging environments. This year, my efforts had culminated in my securing the lead consulting role for the restoration of the historic Hawthorne Manor in upstate New York, a sprawling, dilapidated Gilded Age estate slated for conversion into a public museum. It was a career-defining project involving complex structural analysis, an intricate understanding of period materials, and coordination with a team of specialized artisans, a testament to my skill, my reputation within the field, and the years I'd invested in mastering my craft. The grant that funded a significant portion of the restoration, a highly competitive federal award, bore my name as the principal investigator, a distinction that filled me with a quiet, earned pride. When I hesitantly shared this news with my parents during a Sunday call, hoping for a glimmer of the enthusiasm they reserved for Michael, the response was predictably deflating. "Oh, that sounds challenging, dear," my mother offered, her tone lacking any real warmth. My father, ever practical, simply asked, "Will it pay well, Eleanor?" "You know, Michael just landed an interview with that prestigious banking firm. Quite the opportunity." The conversation, as always, pivoted sharply back to Michael's latest, more financially conventional endeavor. There was no genuine curiosity about the Hawthorne Manor's architectural intricacies, no recognition of the sheer dedication required to secure such a prominent role, just a swift, almost imperceptible dismissal. Thankfully, I had Sarah, my closest friend since college, a fellow academic in a different discipline, who understood the unique joys and frustrations of our world. Sarah was my unwavering emotional anchor, a perceptive witness to the casual cruelty of my parents' indifference. "It's incredible, Elle," she'd said over video call, her face beaming with genuine excitement after I'd shown her grainy photos of the manor's collapsing conservatory. "This is exactly what you've worked for. They just don't get it, do they? But that doesn't make it any less magnificent." Her validation, her steadfast belief in my worth and my achievements, often felt like a balm against the sting of my parents' persistent oversight, reminding me that my success, even if unseen by them, was undeniably real and profoundly meaningful. Amidst the demanding schedule of the Hawthorne Manor project, a new, unwelcome presence began to assert itself in my life, a persistent, gnawing pain in my right knee, an insistent ache that started as a minor nuisance and steadily escalated into a debilitating throb. It was subtle at first, a stiffness after long hours on my feet inspecting blueprints or climbing temporary scaffolding, easily dismissed as part of the job. But as weeks turned into months, the pain sharpened, evolving into a constant companion that stole sleep, made simple tasks arduous, and began to compromise my mobility on site. Characteristically independent, and with a deeply ingrained reluctance to burden anyone, especially my parents, I attempted to self-manage, experimenting with ice packs, over-the-counter pain relievers, and futile stretches, all while maintaining a stoic facade. The notion of admitting vulnerability, particularly a physical one, felt alien after years of proving my self-sufficiency. However, the pain's relentless progression eventually forced my hand, driving me to a series of doctor's appointments. The initial visits yielded vague preliminary diagnoses: tendinitis, chronic inflammation, and a growing stack of medical bills for consultations, x-rays, and specialist referrals that chipped away at my carefully managed savings. This condition, while thankfully not immediately life-threatening, was undeniably debilitating. It impaired my ability to perform crucial aspects of my work, from traversing uneven terrain at the manor to simply focusing on intricate designs without a constant dull ache pulling at my concentration. The financial strain of these escalating medical explorations piled onto my existing responsibilities, weaving a new thread of anxiety into the already complex tapestry of my life. The thought, fleeting and unwelcome, of reaching out to my parents for help surfaced in moments of exhaustion and desperation. Yet, each time, the memory of their dismissive responses to past, far less critical needs, the car repair, the modest request for airfare, solidified into a formidable barrier. The deeply ingrained pattern of their conditional support, always readily available for Michael's grand ambitions, but conspicuously absent for my practical struggles, left me with a profound hesitation. The emotional cost of another polite refusal, another reminder of my lesser status, felt almost as daunting as the physical pain itself. The sterile glow of the orthopedic surgeon's office offered little comfort as he delivered the definitive diagnosis: a torn meniscus and significant cartilage damage in my right knee, requiring a specific non-elective arthroscopic surgery. He laid out the prognosis with a matter-of-fact tone: continued deterioration, increasing pain, and eventual severe mobility issues if left unaddressed. The estimated cost for the procedure, even after my admittedly decent insurance, was a stark and intimidating $9,000. It wasn't an exorbitant sum in the grand scheme of medical expenses, certainly not in the league of Michael's MBA tuition, but for me, it was a substantial, almost crushing figure that would decimate my emergency fund and create a gaping hole in my meticulous budget. The emotional impact of the diagnosis hit me with the force of a physical blow. A cold wave of fear washed over me as the reality of my body's vulnerability set in, swiftly followed by a profound sense of exhaustion. I felt physically and emotionally drained, the relentless pain now compounded by the daunting financial pressure. This wasn't a luxury, an elective cosmetic procedure, or a frivolous indulgence. This was crucial for my quality of life, for my very ability to continue the work I loved, the work that defined so much of my independent identity. Without the surgery, my career at Hawthorne Manor, and indeed any future hands-on preservation projects, would become untenable. My meticulously crafted world, built on self-reliance and quiet competence, suddenly felt terrifyingly fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. In that moment, the weight of the $9,000 felt heavier than any architectural beam I'd ever helped restore. It was a breaking point, a stark realization that, despite my fierce independence, I simply could not navigate this alone. With a deep, unwelcome swallow of pride, I knew, with a certainty that both shamed and compelled me, that I had to ask my parents for help. The thought itself was a bitter testament to my desperation, a painful acknowledgement that the emotional risk of their refusal was now secondary to the overwhelming need for physical healing. My hand trembled, a betraying tremor against the cool plastic of my phone as I dialed their familiar number, the rhythmic pulses a prelude to a conversation I dreaded more profoundly than the looming surgery itself. I had meticulously rehearsed my plea, crafting each sentence with deliberate precision, anticipating their probable skepticism, determined to present my medical predicament with an irrefutable logic and a veneer of unwavering calm. "Hi, Mom, Dad," I began, my voice, despite my efforts, carrying a faint, undeniable tremor of the anxiety churning within me. "I finally have a definitive diagnosis for my knee pain. It's a torn meniscus and cartilage damage, requiring arthroscopic surgery. It's non-elective, crucial for my long-term mobility, and frankly, for me to continue working effectively on projects like Hawthorne Manor." I carefully articulated the medical necessity, detailing the pain's relentless escalation, its debilitating impact on my daily life, outlining the surgeon's recommendations and the arduous rehabilitation ahead. And then, taking a fortifying breath, I stated the exact figure: $9,000, after my insurance contributes. I was truly hoping that perhaps you might be able to help me with it. The ensuing silence stretched, thin and fraught with unspoken expectations. Before my mother's familiar sigh, a sound laden with a lifetime of subtle judgment permeated the line. 9,000, Eleanor? Are you absolutely certain this isn't something physical therapy could address? Or perhaps a second opinion? You know how quickly doctors jump to the most expensive solutions. My father then interjected, his tone laced with a dismissive skepticism that twisted painfully in my gut. That seems rather steep for a knee, especially when we just covered Michael's new residency application fees. Those add up, you know. And his semester tuition for the MBA is due again next month, another significant outlay. Michael, always Michael, his expenses a convenient shield. A fresh wave of cold panic washed over me. It's non-elective, I reiterated, my voice tighter now, edged with a growing desperation. The damage is already significant, Dad. Physical therapy alone won't repair a tear like this, and it's affecting my ability to walk, to work. I can't put this off. My mother interjected, a veneer of concern thinly disguising her judgment. Of course, we're concerned for your health, darling, but you're so good with money, so independent. We always tell our friends how self-sufficient you are. Surely you have an emergency fund for something like this? The hypocrisy of her words stung, a searing reminder of their unwavering financial support for Michael's ambitions, a stark contrast to their expectation of my perpetual self-reliance. My emergency fund will be completely depleted and more after this, I admitted, the last vestiges of my practiced calm dissolving. And honestly, the thought of starting from scratch after recovery, with this level of debt, is terrifying. I just thought, given Michael's MBA, that maybe, for something medically necessary, you could help. The plea was out, raw and vulnerable. There was another pause, colder this time, before my father delivered the final, crushing blow. Eleanor, we've already committed a substantial amount to Michael's education, an investment in his long-term future. We simply don't have an extra 9,000 sitting around. You'll need to figure this out, just like you always do. My mother added, almost as an afterthought. Perhaps a payment plan, dear, or a personal loan? The conversation ended shortly after, their words a clear, unyielding refusal. I hung up the phone, the receiver heavy in my hand. The silence in my apartment no longer just quiet, but profound and utterly desolate. My chest ached with a pain that eclipsed my knee, a deep, sickening hollowness. They hadn't just refused the money. They had refused me, leaving me heartbroken and utterly alone in my moment of desperate need. The golden child's future was worth $120,000. My health, my ability to walk and work, wasn't worth $9,000. The message was devastatingly clear. The crushing finality of my father's words left a void in their wake, a silence so profound it seemed to suck all the air from my apartment. For a long time after the call ended, I sat motionless, the phone still clutched in my hand, a cold, dead weight. The initial shock gave way to a wave of desolation so immense it felt physical, a hollow ache in my chest that mirrored the gnawing pain in my knee. It was the familiar, soul-deep loneliness of a child who has, once again, been left standing on the platform after the train has pulled away. But then, simmering beneath the surface of that cold grief, something else began to stir, a slow, hot surge of anger, pure and clarifying. It wasn't the volatile, fleeting anger of a tantrum, but a deep, tectonic fury that burned away the tears before they could form. This wasn't just about the $9,000. It was about the cold, hard calculus of my parents' love, a brutal equation that screamed, Michael's ambition is worth $120,000, while your health, your very ability to function, is worth less than a tenth of that. The injustice of it, the sheer, staggering unfairness of their valuation, was a revelation. It stripped away the last vestiges of my hope that their neglect was an oversight, revealing it instead as a conscious, long-standing policy. My mind, sharp with this newfound righteous anger, began to sift through the years of casual dismissals, and an image surfaced with crystalline clarity: the family heirlooms. My grandmother's amethyst and pearl necklace, a delicate filigree masterpiece, and my great-grandfather's rare stamp collection, housed in musty, leather-bound albums. They were not just objects. They were potent symbols of a legacy I was never meant to inherit, a family connection that had always been dangled just out of my reach, always presented with the implicit understanding that they were Michael's birthright. I remembered a specific Christmas years ago when my father had brought out the stamp albums, his voice hushed with reverence as he explained their appreciating value to a bored teenage Michael. "This collection," he'd said, his hand resting on Michael's shoulder, "is a significant asset, a real investment." My mother had done the same with the necklace, holding it up to the light, not for me to admire, but to instruct Michael on its provenance and worth. They were assets, investments, not sentimental keepsakes, but another form of capital to be bestowed upon the golden child. In that moment of searing clarity, a quiet, unyielding resolve began to form, a cold and deliberate purpose solidifying in the crucible of my pain. If my worth was to be measured in dollars, and if their love was a commodity to be invested, then I would simply collect on a debt they had unknowingly accrued over a lifetime of neglect. I walked over to my laptop, my movements stiff but purposeful. The pain in my knee was a dull throb, a physical reminder of the stakes. I began to research, my fingers flying across the keyboard, typing in precise professional queries. Value of early 20th century amethyst filigree jewelry. Appraisal services for pre-war international stamp collections. As the search results populated the screen, revealing figures that far surpassed my immediate need, the path forward, once shrouded in a fog of hurt and desperation, became stark and unavoidable. It was a difficult decision, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt so irrevocably final. It was an act of severance, a self-funded surgery, not just on my knee, but on the diseased, toxic limb of my family. My professional life had trained me in the art of meticulous, discreet research, a skill I now turned to a deeply personal and clandestine purpose. I couldn't simply walk into a local jeweler with photographs. The risk of discovery, of a small-town connection back to my parents, was too great. Instead, I spent hours online, vetting high-end antique jewelry appraisers in cities hundreds of miles away, finally settling on a reputable firm in Chicago, known for its expertise in Edwardian pieces. I had a few clear, high-resolution photos from a family anniversary party years ago, where my mother had worn the amethyst necklace. I could picture it perfectly, a cascade of deep purple stones cradled in a web of delicate gold filigree, and I supplemented the images with a detailed written description from memory. The specific cut of the stones, the unique clasp, the faint inscription I'd once glimpsed on the back. My inquiry was cloaked in a plausible fiction, a woman looking to value a piece inherited from a distant relative, considering it for insurance purposes. The stamp collection presented a greater challenge. Without direct access, I had to rely on the echoes of my father's boastful pronouncements to Michael. I remembered him pointing out specific stamps with reverence. A particular block of early German Zeppelin airmail stamps, a rare misprinted British colonial issue. Using these fragments, I pieced together a profile of the collection's potential highlights and contacted a distinguished philatelic society based in Philadelphia, posing as a potential seller who had come into a similar inheritance and was trying to gauge its worth before committing to a formal appraisal. The responses, arriving in the sterile privacy of my email inbox, were staggering. The Chicago jeweler provided a preliminary online appraisal for the necklace, estimating its value between $15,000 and $20,000, contingent on an in-person inspection. The philatelist, based on my description of the key pieces, was even more startling. He stated that if the collection was as I described, its value would be well into the six figures. The numbers shimmered on my screen, a combined value so vast, so far beyond my desperate need for $9,000, that it felt like a physical blow. The information landed with the force of a final, irrefutable verdict, and in that moment, any lingering resolve I needed was solidified into unshakable certainty. These objects, these symbols of an unattainable family legacy, of a love and worth I was perpetually denied, underwent a profound transformation. They ceased to be heirlooms representing family connection and became what my parents had always secretly considered them: assets. A trust fund, a medical insurance policy, a vast reserve of value they had deemed me unworthy of even a fraction of, even for my own health and survival. A tremor of guilt, a ghost of my former self's conditioning, whispered the word theft, but the memory of my mother's dismissive sigh and my father's cold financial calculus was a righteous fire that incinerated it on the spot. My anger, now honed to a sharp, precise point, and my raw desperation for a life free from debilitating pain, completely overshadowed any vestige of guilt. This was no longer an ethical dilemma. It was a practical solution. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. It was a simple, clinical withdrawal to cover a non-negotiable expense from an account that should have been accessible to me all along. The anger did not cool. It congealed into a cold, hard resolve, a diamond of purpose forged under immense pressure. My mind, now operating with the detached precision of a historical archivist cataloging artifacts, shifted from the emotional fallout of the refusal to the practical logistics of the reclamation. I knew exactly where the heirlooms were kept, not in a bank, but in a heavy fireproof safe concealed behind a false bookshelf in my father's home study, a room I knew with the intimate familiarity of a childhood spent trying to earn his attention. Access was the first problem to solve, and the solution came from a memory, a moment of casual cruelty I hadn't fully processed at the time. About a year ago, during a visit, I had overheard my father speaking to Michael in the study. "Don't you ever forget this code, son," he'd said, his voice a low conspiratorial murmur. "It's your birthday, month and day, followed by your graduation year from Princeton, a tribute to the two best days of my life." The words, meant as a loving affirmation for Michael, had been a casual dagger for me, a stark reminder of which child's milestones were deemed worthy of commemoration. At the time, I had simply absorbed the sting and moved on. Now, that painful memory transformed into a strategic advantage, a key forged from their blatant favoritism. The code? A six-digit number representing Michael's triumphant entry into the world and his celebrated departure from academia, was now seared into my brain. The next step was timing. The opportunity presented itself with an almost poetic convenience a week later, when my mother called to inform me they were heading to their timeshare in Aspen for a long weekend, a trip they took every autumn. "Just to see the leaves change, dear," she'd said, oblivious. "We'll be gone from Thursday morning until late Sunday night." That gave me a clear 72-hour window. My plan, therefore, became a meticulous, multi-stage operation driven by a profound and righteous sense of injustice. I would use the old house key I still possessed, the one they never bothered to ask for back, assuming I had no reason to return unannounced. On Friday, under the cover of a workday, I would drive to their house, enter the study, and open the safe. I would not be greedy. This was not a smash and grab for everything of value. It was a clinical extraction. I would take only two items: my grandmother's amethyst necklace and the specific leather-bound album containing the German Zeppelin airmail stamps, the collection's most valuable and easily transportable component. My research from Part 8 had already laid the groundwork for the final phase. I booked a flight to Chicago for the following Tuesday, under the guise of a last-minute consultation for a new project, a perfectly plausible alibi. From there, I would take a train to Philadelphia. I had the contact information for the appraiser and the Philatelic Society, both of whom had already expressed keen interest. I would conduct the sales in person, demanding payment via a certified check or direct wire transfer to a new bank account I had opened for this sole purpose. Every step was deliberate, every detail considered, not with the frenzied energy of a thief, but with the calm, methodical focus of a creditor, collecting a long overdue, morally justified debt. This was not an act of passion or revenge. It was a surgical correction of a profound and painful imbalance. The familiar click of the old key in the lock sounded unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the Friday afternoon, a sound that echoed not with nostalgia, but with the sharp crack of transgression. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the quiet hum of the refrigerator as I stepped over the threshold of my childhood home. Now an alien territory I was invading with deliberate, calculated intent. The air was thick with the scent of my mother's potpourri and my father's faint, lingering pipe tobacco, a combination that normally meant comfort but now felt suffocating, accusatory. I moved with a strange, icy calm, my earlier adrenaline settling into a laser-focused purpose as I made my way directly to the study, the sanctum sanctorum of my father's world. The room was just as I remembered: dark wood, leather-bound books that were more for show than for reading, and a palpable sense of order and control. I bypassed his imposing mahogany desk and went straight to the built-in bookshelf, my fingers finding the barely perceptible seam of the false section. It swung open with a soft, well-oiled whisper, revealing the squat, dark gray fireproof safe. My breath caught in my throat as I knelt before it, my knee sending a sharp, insistent throb up my leg, a timely and potent reminder of why I was there. My hands, surprisingly steady, reached for the combination dial. A bitter, metallic taste filled my mouth as I entered the sequence, each number a separate, distinct act of defiance. Michael's birthday, a day always celebrated with near-regal fanfare, followed by the year he graduated from Princeton, an event my father still referred to as his proudest moment. The irony was so thick I could taste it. The very code meant to secure the family legacy for the chosen son was now the key to my own survival, a tool of liberation forged from their blatant favoritism. A final, satisfyingly solid clunk echoed in the silent room as the tumblers aligned and the heavy door unsealed. Pulling it open revealed the dark, velvet-lined interior, a treasure box of their priorities. My eyes immediately found the targets. I ignored the stacks of bonds, the property deeds, and my mother's other jewelry. My mission was surgical. I reached in, and my fingers closed around the cool, substantial weight of my grandmother's amethyst necklace, the stones feeling like frozen tears against my skin. It was heavier than I'd imagined, a tangible piece of the history I was now reclaiming. Beside it lay the leather-bound stamp albums. I selected the one I knew held the German Zeppelin issues, its worn cover soft beneath my fingertips. This wasn't a frenzied smash and grab. It was a transaction, a precise withdrawal to cover a non-negotiable medical expense and a small buffer for my unpaid recovery time. I felt a surge of something powerful and terrifying, not joy, but a grim, unassailable satisfaction. This was the tangible price of my health, the physical manifestation of justice. I carefully placed the necklace and the album into my canvas tote bag, closed the heavy safe door, spun the dial, and swung the false bookshelf back into place, leaving no trace of my presence. As I walked out of the study and locked the front door behind me, the key turning with a final, definitive click, I knew I had crossed a Rubicon. The cool weight in my bag was not just the value of gems and old paper. It was the weight of my own freedom, bought and paid for, with a currency of their own making. The train ride to Chicago was a blur of muted landscapes and the low, constant hum of the wheels on the track. a sound that mirrored the single, unwavering thought in my mind. The canvas tote bag sat on my lap, its weight a constant physical reminder of the precious, stolen history it contained. My destination was a discreet, appointment-only jeweler located on a quiet side street off the Magnificent Mile, a world away from the dusty archives and crumbling manners I was used to. The office was a study in minimalist luxury: brushed steel, soft gray walls, and a single, intimidatingly large desk. The man who greeted me, Mr. Abernathy, was as polished and precise as his surroundings. He didn't ask for a backstory. His interest was purely in the object I placed carefully on the black velvet tray before him. He picked up my grandmother's amethyst necklace with a pair of tweezers, the intricate gold filigree catching the light. For several long minutes, the only sound was the soft scratching of his loop against the metal and stone. I felt a strange detachment, as if watching a scene from a movie. This object, which had been dangled as a symbol of unattainable family love for my entire life, was now being clinically assessed for its base market value. "It's a beautiful example of Edwardian craftsmanship," he said finally, his voice neutral, devoid of emotion. "The amethysts are of a very high quality, deep Siberian purple. The filigree work is exquisite and undamaged." He named a price, $14,000. It was more than I needed, but less than the high-end estimate. A fair market offer from a professional who knew he was dealing with a private, motivated seller. My heart didn't leap with joy. It settled with a grim, heavy finality. "I'll accept that," I said, my voice as steady as his. The transaction was swift and impersonal. He guided me through the paperwork, and I watched as he initiated a wire transfer to the new, untraceable bank account I had opened the week before. On my phone, I saw the notification appear almost instantly: a deposit of $14,000. The number glowed on the screen, a tangible digital symbol of my independence, a stark testament to what I had been forced to do to provide for myself. There was no elation, only a profound and hollow sense of grim satisfaction. I had done it. I had secured the funds my own parents had denied me. But the victory was tainted by the lingering, bitter pain of what had led me to this sterile, anonymous office. This money wasn't a windfall, it was a reimbursement for their emotional and financial neglect. As I walked out into the bustling Chicago afternoon, the $14,000 in my account felt less like wealth, and more like evidence. I found a quiet corner in a nearby coffee shop, the warmth of a mug a small comfort in my hands, and pulled out my phone. I navigated to the surgeon's office number, my fingers moving with a newfound steadiness. The pain in my knee throbbed, a dull, familiar ache. "Dr. Miller's office," a cheerful voice answered. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I'm calling to schedule my surgery. My name is Eleanor Vance." The preoperative room was a world of pale blues and beeping machines, a sterile antechamber where I sat in a thin paper gown, my human complexities reduced to a series of numbers on a chart. A cold knot of nervousness tightened in my stomach, a familiar fear. But as I waited, I realized it was different from the raw panic I'd felt after my parents' phone call. This was a contained, manageable anxiety, the fear of the unknown, of the procedure itself, not the soul-crushing dread of abandonment. I had purchased this solution, I reminded myself, my hand unconsciously going to my leg. I had provided for my own care. This realization brought a strange, quiet solitude, a sense of ownership over my own fate that was both terrifying and profoundly empowering. When they finally wheeled me into the operating room, the bright, focused lights felt less like an interrogation and more like a spotlight on a new beginning. My last conscious thought before the anesthesia pulled me under was not of my parents or of Michael, but of the intricate filigree on my grandmother's necklace. A silent, final goodbye. Waking up in the recovery room was a slow, foggy ascent from a deep, dreamless void. My first sensation was a dull, throbbing ache in my knee, but it was a different kind of pain from the one that had plagued me for months. The old pane had been a grating, degenerative presence, a sign of decay. This new pane was sharp, yes, but it felt clean, purposeful. It was the pane of healing. As the fog cleared, the emotional impact followed. A wave of relief so immense, it felt like a physical release washed over me. And for the first time in a year, I felt the absence of a heavier, invisible weight I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying. It was the weight of their disapproval, of my own feeling of worthlessness, and of the constant grinding stress of my deteriorating health. That weight was gone, lifted by a single decisive act and a $14,000 wire transfer. Sarah was a constant, warm presence in the days that followed, a bulwark against the loneliness of recovery. She arrived at my apartment armed with homemade soup, trashy magazines, and a cheerful, non-judgmental patience that was more healing than any pain medication. She propped pillows, fetched ice packs, and sat with me for hours, her unquestioning support a lifeline. "So, did that big project finally pay out?" she asked once, her curiosity gentle. I deflected with a vague explanation about a surprise freelance bonus, a lie that tasted like ash in my mouth but felt like a necessary shield. The truth of my bonus was a truth too complicated, too raw, and too mine to share, even with her. My recovery was steady, a slow but determined march forward. Each small victory, a trip to the kitchen on crutches, the first tentative therapist-guided bend of the knee, the eventual shedding of the heavy brace, felt monumental. With each step, I felt not just my physical strength returning, but a new, resilient focus sharpening within me. I was rebuilding myself, bone and sinew, one painful, deliberate movement at a time, on a foundation I had laid myself. The call that I knew on some level was inevitable came on a Tuesday evening, nearly 3 weeks after my surgery, a time when I was just beginning to walk without the aid of a crutch. My mother's voice was a ragged, unfamiliar thing, stripped of its usual measured composure and frayed with a raw, panicked edge that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. "Eleanor, someone's been in the house! We've been robbed!" she cried, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. For a moment, a genuine jolt of alarm went through me, an old, instinctual fear for their safety, before the cold reality of the situation reasserted itself. I remained silent, a calm, cold observer of the chaos I had authored. "The safe is open, your grandmother's amethyst necklace, the one I was going to wear for the Henderson wedding. It's gone!" In the background, I could hear my father's voice, a low, furious rumble that was far more terrifying than my mother's hysteria. "Check the stamps, Margaret! My God, check the stamps!" There was a clatter, the sound of the phone being dropped or set down hard, and a moment of muffled shouting before my mother came back on the line, her voice now a choked sob. "He's in the study. Oh God, Eleanor, your father. He's saying the Zeppelin album is gone too." In their panic, their true priorities were laid bare with a brutal, unflinching honesty. My mother wasn't mourning a sentimental connection to her own mother. She was mourning the loss of a status symbol. "That necklace was for Michael's future wife," she wailed, the pronoun landing like a hammer blow. "It was a family legacy, a symbol of our history he was meant to carry on." The intrinsic value to her was not in the memory, but in its designated future purpose as a marital offering for the golden child. My father's grief was even more transparent, his voice cutting through the background noise with furious clarity. "That collection was our nest egg. It was worth a fortune! A fortune! It was Michael's inheritance, his security!" The words, meant for my mother, echoed directly into my ear, a perfect, damning summary of their worldview. These were not cherished heirlooms. They were assets, investments set aside for the only child who mattered. But then, amidst the frantic discussion of police reports and insurance claims, the narrative began to shift. "But nothing else is gone," my mother said, a note of deep confusion entering her voice. "The silver is here, the television, your father's watches. Nothing is broken, no windows forced. It doesn't make any sense. Why would a thief only take those two things? A heavy silence descended on their end of the line, a silence so profound I could almost hear the gears of suspicion beginning to grind. It was my father who broke it, his voice no longer booming with rage but dangerously low, a cold, sharp point of dawning horror. Margaret, who knew what was in there? Who knew exactly what to take? Another beat of silence, and then my mother's voice, when it came back, was completely transformed. The panic was gone, replaced by an icy, terrifying suspicion. Eleanor, she said, her tone flat and accusatory. You still have your old key to the house, don't you? The unspoken question hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. In the background, I heard my father's furious, sibilant whisper, a command to my mother. Ask her about her surgery. Ask her where she got the money. My mother took a sharp breath, and her final words were not a question, but a verdict. Eleanor, how did you pay for your surgery? They didn't call again. They appeared, a united front of simmering rage and brittle composure standing at my apartment door the very next evening. They used their own key, a clear violation of my space, an immediate assertion of their perceived authority. My mother entered first, her face a mask of strained concern, while my father followed, a thundercloud of a man, his silence a far more potent threat than my mother's anxious chatter. I was in the living room, doing my prescribed physical therapy exercises, and I rose slowly, deliberately, the slight limp in my walk a silent, physical testament to the entire affair. We were in the neighborhood, my mother began, her voice a little too bright, her eyes scanning my apartment as if searching for evidence. We wanted to see how you were recovering. The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. I simply gestured to an armchair, my own movements measured and calm as I carefully lowered myself onto the sofa, a fortress of quiet resolve. For a few agonizing moments, my mother filled the silence with pointless pleasantries about my recovery, all while my father sat ramrod straight, his hands gripping the arms of the chair, his knuckles white with a fury he was struggling to contain. Finally, my mother's facade crumbled. Eleanor, we told you on the phone. Something terrible has happened. We've been robbed. She watched my face, a hawk searching for a flicker of guilt, a telltale sign of complicity. I met her gaze with a cool, impassive expression. That's terrible, I said, my voice even. Have you filed a police report? The question, so practical and detached, seemed to throw her. Well, yes, of course, but the thing is, Eleanor, it's so specific, she pressed on, leaning forward slightly. They didn't take anything else of value, just the necklace and that one specific stamp album. How would a common burglar know to take only those things? How would they know the safe code? She let the questions hang in the air, heavy and accusatory. I remained silent, my composure a blank wall against which her suspicions crashed and receded. My silence was not a confession. It was a refusal to participate in her narrative. It was this unnerving calm, this absolute lack of the defensive panic they expected, that finally made my father snap. Let's cut the theatrics, Margaret, he bit out, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He turned his full, wrathful attention to me. Isn't it a funny coincidence, Eleanor, that just when you find yourself in need of a significant sum of money, a sum we were unfortunately unable to provide, the two most valuable, easily transportable assets we own simply vanish? He stood up then, pacing the small space in front of me, his presence dominating the room, radiating a palpable, menacing anger. So let's stop playing these games. I'm going to ask you one more time, and I expect a straight answer. Where did you get the money for your surgery? He stopped directly in front of me, his shadow falling over me, his face a mask of cold fury. The air crackled with the unspoken, with the years of resentment, with the profound, ugly truth of our family's imbalance. He, my mother, the room itself, all seemed to hold their breath, waiting for my defense, my denial, my confession. I simply looked up at him, my expression unchanging, and held his gaze. I said nothing. I let the accusation, in all its ugliness, hang in the air between us, a monument to their own making. They didn't call again. They appeared, a united front of simmering rage and brittle composure standing at my apartment door the very next evening. They used their own key, a clear violation of my space, an immediate assertion of their perceived authority. My mother entered first, her face a mask of strained concern, while my father followed, a thundercloud of a man, his silence a far more potent threat than my mother's anxious chatter. I was in the living room, doing my prescribed physical therapy exercises, and I rose slowly, deliberately, the slight limp in my walk a silent physical testament to the entire affair. "We were in the neighborhood," my mother began, her voice a little too bright, her eyes scanning my apartment as if searching for evidence. "We wanted to see how you were recovering." The lie was so transparent, it was almost insulting. I simply gestured to an armchair, my own movements measured and calm as I carefully lowered myself onto the sofa, a fortress of quiet resolve. For a few agonizing moments, my mother filled the silence with pointless pleasantries about my recovery, all while my father sat ramrod straight, his hands gripping the arms of the chair, his knuckles white with a fury he was struggling to contain. Finally, my mother's facade crumbled. "Eleanor, we told you on the phone. Something terrible has happened. We've been robbed." She watched my face, a hawk searching for a flicker of guilt, a telltale sign of complicity. I met her gaze with a cool, impassive expression. "That's terrible," I said, my voice even. "Have you filed a police report?" The question, so practical and detached, seemed to throw her. "Well, yes, of course, but the thing is, Eleanor, it's so specific," she pressed on, leaning forward slightly. "They didn't take anything else of value, just the necklace and that one specific stamp album. How would a common burglar know to take only those things? How would they know the safe code?" She let the questions hang in the air, heavy and accusatory. I remained silent, my composure a blank wall against which her suspicions crashed and receded. My silence was not a confession. It was a refusal to participate in her narrative. It was this unnerving calm, this absolute lack of the defensive panic they expected, that finally made my father snap. "Let's cut the theatrics, Margaret," he bit out, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He turned his full, wrathful attention to me. "Isn't it a funny coincidence, Eleanor, that just when you find yourself in need of a significant sum of money, a sum we were unfortunately unable to provide, the two most valuable, easily transportable assets we own simply vanish?" He stood up then, pacing the small space in front of me, his presence dominating the room, radiating a palpable, menacing anger. "So let's stop playing these games. I'm going to ask you one more time, and I expect a straight answer. Where did you get the money for your surgery?" He stopped directly in front of me, his shadow falling over me, his face a mask of cold fury. The air crackled with the unspoken, with the years of resentment, with the profound, ugly truth of our family's imbalance. He, my mother, the room itself, all seemed to hold their breath, waiting for my defense, my denial, my confession. I simply looked up at him, my expression unchanging, and held his gaze. I said nothing. I let the accusation, in all its ugliness, hang in the air between us, a monument to their own making. The silence in the room stretched, taut and vibrating with my father's unspoken fury. But for the first time in my life, I felt no fear in its presence, only a profound and weary pity. I looked from his face, a mask of apoplectic rage, to my mother's, which was a canvas of horrified suspicion, and I finally broke the stillness. My voice, when it came, was not shaky or apologetic, but as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. I didn't steal them, I stated, the words dropping like stones into the quiet pool of their anger. I liquidated an asset to cover a critical, unfunded medical expense. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her chest as if I had physically struck her. "How could you?" she whispered, the words trembling with disbelief. "Eleanor, your grandmother's necklace." My father's reaction was a low, incredulous hiss. "You sold them? You sold my property? Michael's inheritance?" He took a step forward, his entire body radiating a menacing aura, but I didn't flinch. I held his gaze, my own resolve a newfound, unbreachable fortress. "Yes," I said, my voice gaining strength with every word of truth I unleashed. "I sold the necklace. I didn't need to sell the stamps. The necklace alone covered the cost. I needed $9,000 for a non-elective surgery, a procedure required for me to walk without pain, to keep my job, to live a functional life. I came to you, my parents, in a moment of genuine desperation and vulnerability, and you, who had just spent $120,000 on Michael's MBA without a second thought, told me to figure it out. So I did." The shock on their faces began to curdle into pure outrage, but I continued, the words a torrent of years of suppressed pain finally breaking free. "This was never about a single no. This was about a lifetime of them. It was about the $1,800 car repair I begged for a loan for, while Michael got a new convertible for his birthday. It was about the $1,500 plane ticket for an unpaid internship that could have launched my career, a request you dismissed as character building while you funded Michael's 6-month cultural tour of Asia. It was about every single achievement of mine that was met with polite disinterest, while every minor accomplishment of his was celebrated like a national holiday." I stood up then, my newly repaired knee holding my weight, steady and strong. "And those heirlooms? Let's be honest about what they really were. They were never symbols of family legacy. They were symbols of Michael's legacy. They were props you used to show him his worth, his place, his inheritance. To me, they were just another reminder of my own lack of value in this family. You just said it yourself, Dad. Michael's inheritance. You said it on the phone, Mom. It was for Michael's future wife. They were never heirlooms. They were assets. A nest egg. You taught me that. You taught me their monetary value, not their sentimental worth. So I made a choice. I decided that my ability to walk, my health, my present, was a more worthy investment than a necklace for Michael's hypothetical future wife. I took one of the assets you had mentally and verbally allocated to his future, and I invested it in my survival. You wanted me to be self-sufficient? Congratulations, you finally got your wish." My parents' retreat from my apartment was not an ending, but the opening salvo in a different kind of war. One fought not with direct confrontation, but with the insidious weapons of family gossip and curated narratives. The first shot was fired 2 days later, not from them directly, but from my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, and the family's emotional barometer, a woman, whose opinion held significant weight among our relatives. Her voice, when she called, was thick with a borrowed outrage, a second-hand betrayal that had been carefully fed to her. "Eleanor, your mother is beside herself. She's utterly devastated. How could you? Stealing from them? Your own grandmother's necklace? A priceless piece of our history." She didn't give me a chance to speak, launching into a tirade about loyalty, respect, and the sanctity of family heirlooms, a speech I was certain my mother had rehearsed with her. I let her finish, listening to the echo of my parents' manufactured victimhood. Then, with the same quiet deliberation I had used with them, I began to dismantle their narrative, not with anger, but with the cold, hard steel of verifiable facts. I didn't raise my voice. I simply presented the timeline, the one Sarah had encouraged me to meticulously document weeks before, a simple ledger of dates and dollars that laid the disparity bare. Did they mention? I asked calmly. That before I sold anything, I came to them for help with a $9,000 surgery that was medically necessary for me to walk without pain and continue my career? Did they tell you they refused, citing Michael's recent expenses? I laid it out for her. The brutal, simple math of their love. Michael's $120,000 MBA, a celebrated investment funded without a moment's hesitation, versus my $9,000 medical bill, dismissed as an inconvenience I should figure out on my own. I finished with a simple, quiet question. Aunt Carol, if you were in debilitating pain and your parents had the means to help but refused you in favor of your siblings' elective education, what would you have done? The silence on the other end of the line was profound, a chasm of dawning realization. The righteous indignation in her voice was gone, replaced by a stunned, horrified understanding. That single conversation was the crack in the dam. Aunt Carol, a woman who, for all her love of drama, valued fundamental fairness above all else, became an unlikely and unwitting conduit for the truth. The story, my side of it, began to circulate through the tight-knit network of cousins and uncles. The narrative my parents had tried to spin, of an ungrateful, unstable, thieving daughter, was too flimsy, too riddled with convenient omissions, to hold up against the stark, verifiable truth of their gross favoritism. My Uncle Robert, my father's younger and more level-headed brother, called next, his voice low and apologetic. Ellie, your dad called me, but he left out some key details. I had no idea. What they did? It's indefensible. My cousin Jenny sent a simple text. Team Eleanor, always. The campaign to discredit and isolate me had backfired spectacularly. In their desperate attempt to paint me as a monster, they had only succeeded in illuminating their own monstrous choices, forcing the entire family to see the ugly, unbalanced foundation upon which our dynamic had been built for 30 years. They had intended to make me a pariah. Instead, they had made me a survivor with witnesses, and in doing so, had inadvertently isolated themselves. It was inevitable that Michael would be sent as the final envoy, the cleanup crew dispatched to handle the mess his parents had made. He arrived at my door on a Saturday afternoon, not with the overt fury of our father or the tearful theatrics of our mother, but with the weary, self-important air of an ambassador sent to reason with a rebellious province. He carried a peace offering of expensive coffee and wore a look of pained condescension, as if my actions were a personal inconvenience he was now obligated to manage. Eleanor, this has gone way too far, he began, foregoing any real greeting as he set the coffee on my counter. Mom and Dad are a wreck. You sold Grandma's necklace? It's unbelievable. Whatever point you were trying to make, you've made it. But this is destroying them. You need to fix this. He was parroting their lines, speaking from a script of their victimhood, and I let him finish, my silence a stark contrast to his agitated pacing. I saw then that he didn't truly understand. He couldn't. His entire life had been a frictionless glide, his path paved with a currency of parental approval and financial support he'd never had to question. My confrontation with him was not born of malice or a desire to wound him, but from a desperate, final need for him to simply see the system that had elevated him by pushing me down. Fix it? I repeated, my voice quiet but unyielding. There's nothing to fix, Michael. There is only what happened, and you don't even know what that is. I then laid it out for him, not with anger, but with the dispassionate clarity of a final report. I didn't do this to make a point. I did this to survive. I needed a $9,000 surgery. I begged Mom and Dad for help, and they refused. They told me they were too financially committed to you. I watched his face, saw the flicker of confusion, the first crack in his polished certainty. Do you have any idea what it's like, Michael, to have your ambition, your every step, funded and celebrated, while mine are dismissed? The money they spent on your MBA, without a single question, would have paid for my surgery 13 times over. The convertible they bought you for graduation would have covered the car repair I had to put on a credit card 10 times over. For every yes you received, there was a corresponding no for me, a lecture on self-sufficiency that you never had to hear. He started to formulate a defense, a weak protest about his career being a family investment, but I cut him off with the one detail I knew would pierce his privileged armor. The code to the safe, Michael. The one I used to get the necklace. It was your birthday and your graduation year from Princeton. The two best days of my life. That's what Dad called them. I saw the impact of the words land, a visible, physical blow. His face went pale, the confident set of his jaw slackening as the true, symbolic weight of that detail settled upon him. He sank into the armchair my father had occupied, no longer an ambassador, but just a man staring at a truth he could no longer ignore. My birthday? He stammered, the fight completely gone from his eyes, replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension. He was finally seeing it, the passive, lifelong benefit he had reaped from an imbalance so profound it was literally encoded into the lock meant to protect our family's legacy. He wasn't just a beneficiary, his very existence was the combination. He left 20 minutes later, the expensive coffee untouched on my counter, not with a solution or an apology, but with the shattered look of a man who had been forced to look into a mirror for the very first time and didn't recognize the person staring back. The weeks following Michael's visit were defined by a profound and deafening silence from my parents, a void far more telling than any angry phone call. The familiar rhythm of my mother's weekly check-ins and my father's occasional perfunctory texts ceased completely. They had excommunicated me, casting me out of the familial orbit, and in doing so had given me the one thing I never knew I desperately needed: freedom. The emotional cost was undeniably high. There was a phantom ache where the hope for their approval used to be, a strange, hollow grief for the parents I wished I had, not the ones I did. Yet this sorrow was dwarfed by an overwhelming, exhilarating sense of liberation. It was the feeling of a heavy, suffocating coat finally being shrugged off, of breathing clean, fresh air after a lifetime in a sealed, airless room. I stood firm in my decision, my resolve hardening not into bitterness, but into a quiet, unshakable certainty. I had done what was necessary. After a month of this Cold War, I decided to author the terms of the new peace, or at the very least, the terms of the armistice. I called them, and to my surprise, my father answered. I didn't wait for him to speak. "I'm not calling to apologize," I said, my voice calm and steady, devoid of the pleading tremor that had defined our last conversation. "I'm calling to be clear, so there are no more misunderstandings. What I did was not an act of malice. It was an act of survival. You left me with no other choice. My health, my ability to walk, my career, these things were on the line, and when I came to you for help, you made a clear choice to value Michael's elective education over my essential well-being. You taught me, in that moment, and in countless moments before, that my worth in this family is conditional. I am no longer willing to live by those conditions." I could hear my mother pick up an extension, her sharp intake of breath a prelude to an argument I was not going to have. "From now on," I continued, speaking to them both, "our relationship, if there is to be one, is irrevocably changed. You will not come to my home unannounced again. You will not use Michael's needs as a justification for neglecting mine. You will not treat me as a secondary concern. I am your daughter, but I am also an adult who has now, by your own design, learned to provide for herself in the most absolute terms. My worth is not tied to your approval, and it certainly isn't represented by material possessions you dangle as rewards. I took what I needed to live, from an account that you yourselves designated as family assets. I am simply the part of the family you chose to forget, needed a withdrawal. This is the new reality. You can choose to accept it or not, but the old one is over. I didn't wait for a response. I ended the call, the final, definitive click echoing in the quiet of my apartment. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't a void, it was peace. A hard-won, expensive, and utterly liberating peace. 2 years passed, a period of quiet, steady reconstruction in which I built a life on a foundation that was entirely my own. The grand reopening of Hawthorne Manor was a resounding success, a celebrated triumph of historical preservation that solidified my professional reputation and brought a deep, quiet satisfaction that was wholly untethered from anyone's approval but my own. My career thrived, not with the frantic energy of someone trying to prove their worth, but with the calm confidence of someone who simply knows it. The silence from my parents had eventually broken, not with a bang but a whimper. A tentative, awkward phone call on my birthday, a stilted Christmas card. Our relationship now exists in this liminal space, distant, yet not entirely severed. Our conversations are brief, civil, and conducted entirely on my terms, free of the old toxic dynamics of supplication and dismissal. The power has shifted, not because I wield it over them, but because I no longer grant them any over me. The most profound change, however, came from Michael. He called me a few months after finishing his MBA, his voice stripped of its usual breezy entitlement. He apologized, a real, stumbling, heartfelt apology that acknowledged the depth of his blindness and the unearned ease of his life compared to mine. "I never saw it, Elle," he'd said, his voice thick with a shame that sounded genuine. "I was just floating along on a current that was pulling you under. I'm so sorry." Our relationship is new now, slowly being rebuilt on the foreign territory of mutual respect and a shared, painful honesty. He sees me finally, not as his dramatic older sister, but as an equal. On my small dining table, in a simple glass vase, sits a bouquet of purple hyacinths. They are not a gift from anyone. I bought them for myself. They are a quiet acknowledgement of the complex, intertwined nature of sorrow and forgiveness, a sorrow for the family I wish I'd had, and a private, personal forgiveness, not for their actions but for myself, for finally letting go of the anger. The $14,000 from the necklace had bought me a repaired knee, but the act itself had purchased my soul. I had found my true worth, not locked away in a safe or dangling from a velvet display, but in the quiet resilience of my own spirit. I look to the future with strength and quiet confidence, a woman who paid for her own survival and earned her own peace.